Hello, this is Kade, and it has been quite a while, but yeah, I am back with some Star Citizen stuff. IE is of course ongoing, and there's lots of stuff around all of that, but I wanted to specifically talk about the fact that it's RSI Day, and of course the RSI Polaris is now in the game. A ship I have been, softly said, critical about in the past. So today, with the ship now being in its flyable and final state, well, mostly final, it needs a few touch-ups, I wanted to give my opinion on it and see if, my opinion on it has actually changed. Now, we'll give you a fair warning. There may be an occasional call for my voice may go a bit crazy. I have been sick for weeks now, so it is what it is. But yeah, Polaris is now available to all who own her, and of course to all who are renting her. And of course, the big question is now, is she actually a good ship? And to answer that question, I think the most important thing is that we have to understand that the ship we have now in front of us is a different ship than the design concept was. Not just in its visual appearance, which has of course changed, but primarily in its functional design. And it is this functional design change that has made this ship turn from a highly questionable design to a ship that actually makes a lot of sense. So, yes, if you want to have the short version, did I change my opinion on the Polaris? The answer is yes. You can now continue on with your life if that was your burning question for whatever reason. To those of you who would like to know why I changed my mind, I think we have to go on board the ship to properly explain this fact. So there is a couple of items that have made this change to be what it is. So while we wait for the lovely, overly complicated ramp to deploy here, because of course it is still a Star Citizen ship, they like to make these things overly complicated. What we're looking at now is a fairly sizable vessel, and it is now officially categorized as a capital unit. Which means that this is the smallest capital unit, as far as military ships are concerned, that we're going to be dealing with. Ships like the Hammerhead, and most likely the Perseus, will remain within their sub-capital category, although this may of course change. And of course, ships like the Carrack we have talked before is definitely still going to stay in that sub-capital category. And the only other capital rating ship that we have right now really comes down to the 890 Jump. The 890 Jump also, interesting enough, has a size 4 capital grade jump drive. That is something that the Polaris is missing, which I do think is a bit of an oversight, and I do hope that they will change that around. Considering the speed difference between a size 3 and a size 4 is considerable. So considerable in fact that a size 4 quantum drive actually goes faster than light. Just slightly, but it is faster than light. Oh yeah, let's start out here. Cargo Bay. You may think that's not very special, and you would be absolutely right. It is a cargo bay. But what we have up here is what is gonna make it special. Combined with how the game has changed since the original concept was announced, we have now the option to reload these particular torpedo carousels. We have a total of 4 of these carousels, 7 torpedoes in each, for a total of 28 torpedoes, which is a significant amount more than the original concept had, to begin with. However, the fact that we can now reload these torpedoes while we are within the combat zone has really changed the purpose behind this ship to a very important degree. As before, one of my big critiques about the Polaris was that you would launch your torpedoes, and after that you would be completely useless. Like, literally useless on the combat field. The Polaris had no gunpowder, which of course has changed as well, we'll talk about that. But also it just could not do anything else. It had to go back to a base to rearm its torpedoes, reload its torpedo magazines. But now we can do that from our own cargo bay. Now I'm fairly sure there may be some degree of risk associated with it, but then again, considering how open these particular torpedo carousels are, maybe that's not really going to be the case all that much. Whether we're carrying a bunch of them here and a bunch of them here, I think the additional risk factor is going to be relatively minimal. But what it does mean is that when the Polaris is on the battlefield, we are no longer able to consider it a non-threat at any moment in time. Even if we see it launching 40 torpedoes, we just don't know how many more this particular crew has brought with them. So we have to consider it to be a high threat to our larger vessels as long as the ship is alive. So this is a very important change. Now what I also like, and this is not really as for the reason that I think the ship now makes sense, is the fact that we have a dedicated torpedo console. So there's actually a torpedo man down here underneath the bridge area who is in charge of launching these torpedoes, which I think is a really cool addition and makes a lot of sense for a capital grade vessel. Now up front here we have another important change. Like we said, she now has a fair bit of actually gunnery firepower. With these bespoke twin size 6s, and bespoke here may annoy some people because you cannot change them out, but it also means that they can be individually tuned, so that they're just tuned for the Polaris and not for any other ship, which they have done, so these guns are actually more powerful than standard size 6s. She brings with her a good amount of firepower to deal with a larger to sub-capital grade opponent. So ships like Constellations, but also the Carrack, Hammerheads and Perseus actually have to respect this firepower that this particular turret can put out. It will be capable of penetrating their shields and doing damage to their ships below. So this is another very important change that has made the ship feel a lot better and make it feel more appropriate for the new role that it has. Because I did talk about the design change. So we have a design concept, so it's like how does it look visually, but we also have a functional concept, like what is the ship supposed to be? And this is where my main problem was with originally, as it felt like it was a motor torpedo boat with for some reason a hangar strapped on top of it, which to me felt like a reduction in its capabilities. And I would have replaced that hangar with either gunnery firepower or additional torpedo launchers, as I've discussed. Now the hangar is of course still here, but the ship's purpose now has changed. We are dealing with a slightly larger ship that is now officially capital grade. The torpedoes can be restocked in flight, and our gunnery firepower has seen a substantial upgrade. We're no longer dealing with, dual size 5s, I think it was, under the nose originally, and like a bunch of dual size 3s. No, we now have bespoke size 6s. We have quad size 3s on 4 separate turrets. So we have a fairly good amount of firepower, which means that from a gunnery perspective, this ship can now actually also stay in the fight. But we also have this thing. Now, if you've watched the Squadron 42 demo, and you definitely should have, you'll know what this is. This is our holographic, fleet command station. So from here you can direct and see the full-on engagement of a fleet engagement. Which means that the Polaris can actually now become a flagship. Now, is it going to become a flagship in a UE Navy fleet? No. But the Polaris design was to be sold to militias. And for a militia, having a ship like the Polaris is now at its core of its small flotilla, which will likely be built up from a Polaris, some Perseus, some Hammerheads and fighters and whatever else they can scrounge up, is a very important addition. It will allow them to have a proper command structure in place for all of their operations. Now we may see something like this also appear on the Perseus, we don't know yet, but we are seeing it here on the Polaris, and I do think it makes a lot of sense. And with this addition, the fact that we now have torpedoes that can be reloaded in flight, we have additional gunnery firepower, we have seen the ship's design function change from what looked like a very large torpedo bomber with a hangar on board to an actual flotilla command ship, which provides with it the very big oomph in firepower in the form of those torpedoes, but it has enough other turret firepower to defend itself against other ships and to engage probably not peer opponents but sub-peer opponents in a gunnery duel to a certain degree. And it now has that hangar. And that hangar now actually has a purpose. Now that purpose is not going to be what most people are thinking of when they're looking at that hangar. And most people are thinking of, how many fighters can I cram in there? And of course having some additional fighters on board may seem like sensible. But you have to think again that this is a militia ship. So the fighters that the militia has are probably going to be based on stations or on the ground. They're not going to be based on board other ships. Why? Because fighters will be relatively high in number, they're relatively cheap to come by, especially the older designs, so you will want to have a lot of them just stashed around with pilots, that also have other duties, but in case of a Vandal threat, they can be pulled off those duties, get on board those fighters and form up the fighter wing of your flotilla. So what are you going to use this hangar space for then? Well, you're not always out there at high alert. You're not always dealing with Vandal invasion forces. What you are dealing with is patrolling your system, your area. And what do you need to patrol your area? You need to have information. And what provides better information than ships that have tracking systems on board, like radar systems that are much more powerful than their standard counterparts of their ships would have. So a Terrapin or the Hornet trackers would make an excellent addition towards the Polaris. They can act as the scouting force for your flotilla. Not only that, it also means that your flotilla can go radar silent in case that will actually later on become a part of gameplay. And to explain that, let's take a look at a more close resemblance of what this ship is nowadays, which is more like a Cold War era corvette, which had a single gun quite often, a bunch of missile launchers, and often a hangar space with a helicopter in there. Now the helicopter had two purposes. One of those purposes was anti-submarine warfare. Now we're in space, so everybody here is operating on the same level. So anti-submarine warfare is not of relevance to us. But there was something else that they used these helicopters for, and that was to be their radar. Because you see, if you activate a radar, so an active radar system, you can roughly detect targets only about half the distance away, then somebody else can notice that you're there. And the reason for that is that you're sending out a signal, which has to then hit something and be redirected back towards you. However, the person that is just receiving that signal, he doesn't need to have that redirection. So you may very well be broadcasting that signal much further, but at a distance where any returns are no longer being picked up by you, or they're so faint that even if you do pick them up, you do not actually register them. But your enemy will know immediately where you are, who you are, and what you're operating. So they can launch all of their weapon systems on that radar bearing, where they know that you are located. So a lot of the time you do not want to go in an active sensor suite. So your radar systems, you would not go and blare them on and keep them active, because it would make you a target. So they would take the helicopter, which has a surface search radar, put it in the sky, have it fly, a couple dozen miles away from your fleet, flotilla, or whatever size unit you're operating with, have to go climb up and activate its radar. So yes, everybody will know where it is, but it can see all of the other units. And the other units will probably register the fact that that is a helicopter. So they will know that there's somebody in the area, but they don't know where your main force is. And yes, they may choose very well to shoot at the helicopter. And that may lead to the fact that your helicopter goes kaboom. But it's a lot better to lose a helicopter than to lose one of your main ships. So for the Polaris, this is going to be much of the same. So your Hornet trackers are going to be flying out there, and their job is going to be to find whatever you're looking for. So this could be a pirate fleet, or just lone traders that need to be checked for customs, or of course Handle, or whatever else. Their job is to find it. They'll report those findings back to you, and if they happen to end up getting engaged, and even if they get destroyed, it's sad, but you only lose a Hornet. So if they accidentally run into a couple of Handle destroyers, and those with their escorts, which completely blow them out of the water, that's sad. But all you've lost was a couple of Hornets. Which, really, yeah, it's sad, but you can replace those relatively easily. They're not very pricey, and it means you didn't lose your primary combatant. Your Polaris, your Hammerheads, your Perseus, and all of those ships. Which is going to be very important, because if you know that there's a couple of Handle destroyers around, you probably don't want to be fighting them. It's not going to end well for you. So you will not be fighting them, and you will just be like, okay, people, let's just make sure that we get away, inform the UE navies, like, hey, there's a large Vandal raiding force in this system, help, please. And if you have to, of course, you can always engage, but at least you know what you're dealing with, which is going to be very, very important. So that, for me, is the Polaris nowadays. It really makes sense as a flotilla central command ship. And I think that's what it's going to be used in lore as well. Of course, how we as players are going to be using it is going to be probably to a large degree in the same way. And I do think that people who will run this with like trackers on board are going to have a higher success rate than people who run it with fighters on board. Because yes, a couple of fighters may add a little bit more firepower than a couple of Hornet trackers, but it's not going to be all that much, and you're losing out on a lot of intelligence information. And intelligence information is ever so crucial. So yeah, that is my opinion on the current Polaris. It is a ship that I can now recommend as a ship that makes sense, and especially have an orc that has the people to man a ship like this. Because this is not a solo ship. Not at all. So if you're going to be looking at a ship like this for its operation, we're needing 5 turret gunners. We need a torpedo man. So that's already 6 people there. Then we need, for the remote turrets, we need 2 people there. So that's 8. We need a commanding officer. That's 9. We need a pilot. That's 10. We're going to need at least 1 chief engineer, so that's 11. We're going to need pilots for those Hornets, so boom, already at 13. And considering we have about 12 official bats on board and the captain's quarters, I think that 13 makes a lot of sense. And of course, keep in mind officially that hangar is only designed for 1 fighter. We'll probably put in 2 being players, so that's where we have a small discrepancy. I do not think that the co-pilot seat is going to be all that much required. But if you only fly with like a single fighter on board, or maybe you choose to have those fighter pilots have their respawn in the brig, because, you know, we're players, we don't really care about those kind of things, that does offer you 2 additional beds in there. Hey, that's your fighter pilots, and then you have more crew for the ship itself. So look at having about 14 people on hand during any of your gameplay sessions if you want to make use of a ship like the Polaris. If you do not have that many people around, but you want a larger, combat-capable ship, I would strongly suggest that you look at a Perseus if you want to engage larger vessels, or a Hammerhead if you want to deal with smaller ships. Yes, currently the Hammerhead is not in a great position. Neither is going to be the Polaris because of the way that things work. But as CIG has recently discussed in their latest video around IAE, capital, great ship gameplay will change, and small fighters will individually no longer pose a threat to larger vessels. So that problem is going to get resolved on its own. So if you have a smaller orc, you want to go for combat, you cannot get those 12 to 14 people around all the time whenever you're going to do your gameplay sessions. Get a smaller combat ship. Go for a Perseus, go for a Hammerhead. They will serve you better. But if you do have those amount of people, a Polaris is going to be a really nice addition. And if you grow, you can add a Perseus and a Hammerhead to that flotilla, so that you have multiple holes to play around with. Of course, alternatively, you could look at upgrading towards an Idris. However, keep in mind that Idris is going to require NPC crews, which means it's going to have a constant drain upon your orc's resources. Whereas ships like the Polaris, the Perseus and the Hammerhead do not require NPC crews. They can be fully player manned at all times to really high degrees of effectiveness in fun and engaging roles. Which means that you can have these ships stored around without them being a drain on your resources. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for giving me a listen. I may make some more content as whenever I feel like it, but I really wanted to talk here about the Polaris, considering now that it's finally out and with its complete change in its design function, I can finally recommend this ship, and I'm really happy about that, because I'm much rather to be happy about a ship than to be angry at it and think it's a stupid design. I've been Kade. Thank you so much. Till next time. Goodbye.